Hello, everyone. I'm Larry Bennett, Executive Director of North America for Compo, a French company involved in providing services for book publishers around the world. And today it is my great privilege and great joy to be having a conversation with Thad McIlroy. Thad, whom you may know, is just, the more I get to know about him, he's just an amazing person. Just a little bit of background. Thad worked for retail booksellers in Canada, just starting off with a predecessor to Indigo. He was a small publisher, a distributor, a typesetter, an editor, and a journalist. He's authored or edited a dozen books, some on metadata and on publishing automation, written some 300 or so articles and 450 blog posts. He co-authored the Metadata Handbook, a book publisher's guide to creating and distributing metadata for print and ebooks. So he's on that, geek level, but he's a great communicator at the same time. He's on the advisory board of Johns Hopkins University Press, and he's a visiting scholar at the George Washington University or GW College of Professional Studies. He's also a senior member of the Association for Computing Machinery. So his most recent work, The AI Revolution in Book Publishing, Concise Guide to Navigating Artificial Intelligence for Writers and Publishers, is the subject for this podcast. I read that book twice, and I don't make a practice of reading books twice, but I learned more from this book than any other book I've read in the past decade. Thad, I should also mention, is a supporter of the BISG, or Book Industry Study Group, Workflow Committee and its AI subcommittee. He's a contributing member at Publishers Weekly, focused on publishing innovation and, of course, artificial intelligence. So, Thad, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Larry, for inviting me, and thank you for that very, very kind introduction.
Well, my pleasure. So I'd like to just ask you a series of questions that kind of come from that book that will really help us understand more about AI and its role in publishing. Just from a history standpoint, that AI seems like it popped up out of a magic box just a few years ago. Could you please tell our audience a little bit more about the long history of AI?
Sure, I would. It's fascinating, that most people, have come to AI very recently. ChatGPT came out in November of 2022, so we're only, the better part of 3 years in. But when you look at AI more broadly, and it is, a lot of different technologies fall under the umbrella of AI, and that goes back to, the early 1800s, when some of the first ideas around using machines for, advanced calculations, advanced programming were first posited. It's fascinating to go back to that period, but then you move sort of fast forward into, let's say, the Second World War, where, once again, the idea of trying to build a computer that had some simulated intelligence comes again to the foreground. And again, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and into the 80s, there was in the midst of that, this period that is referred to now, in retrospect, as the AI winter, when largely in the 70s and 80s, what had seemed so promising was not coming through. And so, all the funding and the interest dropped right down. I first started looking at AI in the late 1980s, and my first sort of glimpse was to try and determine, I had already become very involved with publishing automation, and, it's like, well, could AI have some applicability to automation of publishing processes? And the answer was, nope, can't, not at that point. Again, fast forward again, 2017, working with Cliff Gurin, we began to study some of the early startups that were popping up around publishing and AI. And there was the beginning of promise there, a lot of it having to do with linguistic analysis. And indeed, it's linguistic analysis, that brings us forward to 2022, when we have these large language models, which is the current generation of AI. And, that's been the breakthrough that has brought let's say, brought AI to the masses because the interface is natural language. You talk to the AI, and so it's very easy for a non-technical person to access the intelligence.
Of course, that makes sense. And so going back, like you said, to 2017, and the early days of starting to use it in publishing, were editorial services like proofreading and copy editing and maybe indexing some of the earlier uses, or was there something else?
No, that's a very good question and a good point. What it brings to mind, is that there's sort of several divisions that we make within, at analyzing, how AI works, and there's a sort of subclass of AI that's referred to as machine learning, and in machine learning, you're not, accessing the most advanced tools, if I can put it that way. And if you look at something like machine translation, because using machines, using computers to translate has been with us for a great long time. Very frustrating until recently because of the accuracy was so low. But we were using machines in an advanced form that appeared very much like AI. But the large language models, that's been the breakthrough, and something like translation is being revolutionized once again around these language models. It's changing the quality so dramatically.
Sure. Now, in your book, you make a prediction that kind of surprised me, but then as I thought about it, it really made sense. And it's that AI will be more important and empowering to authors than to publishers. Can you talk a little bit about what factors drive that prediction?
A couple of things, Larry. It's on the one hand, on the other hand. So when for example, with Book Industry Study Group, one of the things that I've encouraged, let's say, as when we talk about workflow, publishers tend to sort of act as if the act of publishing a book starts, when they first, you know, acquire a manuscript. Well, actually, before you acquired that manuscript, Mr. Publisher, a lot of activity did take place. That's called an authoring, process, and you have to be thinking sort of inclusively of that when when you are an author. I'm not a fiction author, so I use that much creativity and that much research. But with fiction, they use that much creativity and that much research. So the degree of intelligence, let's say, that goes into a well-written book, puts publishing itself to shame. And these large language models, again, because they're language, they're very, very applicable to the authoring task. And we could talk more about, the controversy as to how much an author can use the tools and so on. But even if we think of it in a minimal way where an author is using them for some idea generation, maybe a little critique of, early versions of the manuscript and so on, it does have real applicability, very profound applicability at the authoring process. And at the same time, something you and I talked about the other day, the authors, as I see it, particularly the self-published authors, they don't have the same hang-ups as large publishing companies do around the utility of the software. There's controversy, but if you're an author trying to be a better author, trying to be a more productive author, these tools are an obvious win. And so I'm seeing real adoption at the authoring level. Well, there's still a lot of concern and conservatism at the publishing side of the equation.
Sure. And your book talked about two different ways that authors, or two different paths that authors can take. One is, as you've been talking about, the authoring tools, the idea generation and maybe fact checking. And, a really good fiction can have a lot of research done around it to support the story. But also, your book talks about how authors can use it to actually supplement or even replace some of the functions, such as marketing, that traditional publishers do. Do you see that as the case as well?
I do. Again, we have to differentiate between traditionally published authors and self-published authors. When you're traditionally published, you hand off the rest of the process. But for self-published authors, they really are little publishing companies, each and every one of them. Sometimes they band together and work together, but mostly it's, an individual is both the author all the way through, to delivering books to customers and reaching out to new readers. So, in that sense, I'm seeing authors trying to take advantage of every which way, that AI can help them. And, surely the thing that's most challenging for authors and publishers today is finding readers, because there's so much noise, because so many books are published. And
Sure.
so, that's where AI ultimately, I think, will have its most profound impact.
Mm-hmm. You make a very interesting distinction in your book between academic and scholarly publishers and trade publishers, saying that the former academic and scholarly publishers will be the early adapters and thus more the beneficiaries of AI. Why do you think that's the case?
It's been very interesting watching the academic slash scholarly community, publishing community, authoring and publishing community, comparing them with the trade publishing community. And what I've seen on the scholarly side is that, sort of the authors are academics, they're researchers, they're scientists. And so, they, like, even more than, let's say, creative authors, are very open to the technology. In fact, are, sort of more than open to it. They're finding, that the tools, AI tools for research, for, searching for the other literatures that's been published on their topic, for evaluating early results, and so on and so on, great applicability. And so they, naturally enough, sort of pushing their publishers to be open. The publishers at the same time on the academic side, are open, and you're seeing a far more robust embrace of AI tools on that side, because they see that their authors are using it and using it very effectively. At the same time, they, I make, try and make the point that scholarly publishers are scientists too, to some extent. A lot of them do come out of the sciences. And so
Sure.
again, the publishers have a good attitude, that they're bringing to the table that is not mirrored on the trade publishing side.
Sure, that makes sense. And one of the things that maybe gets glossed over are some of the risks. So I was wondering, Thad, can you talk a little bit about the risks inherent in AI adoption by publishers, author backlash, which your book mentions, false data, hallucinations?
Yeah. There's tons of risks, right? And one of the things, you've seen in my book, and whenever I'm talking to publishers and to authors, I never try to downplay the risks. I always try and be very upfront about the risks, because they're real, and they're very important to get your mind around. I guess we can divide them kind of into two buckets. The ones that are specific to authoring and publishing, we'll put those over here. And then this much larger bucket, of concerns that humanity has around AI, and environmental gets a lot of coverage. The other one that gets a lot of coverage is job loss, and as with everything with AI, you see these very opposite opinions. But my opinion on job loss is that it's going to be very significant job loss, including in publishing, from this technology. And so we can't downplay that. How are these people going to find other work? What other kind of work will there be for people who are displaced by AI technology? So that's over there. Then we come over to publishing, and of course, everyone who's been around publishing for the last X years, has seen that on the one hand, the large language models clearly obtained work that was in copyright and used that work for training their models. That's the big issue before the courts right now. Was that so-called fair use or not? The courts will be working on that one for some time. But I've said that even if it's legal, is it moral for me to steal your book, Larry, and subsume it into my AI training without your permission, without giving you any
No,
compensation?
no,
Not right.
pay me, Thad. Please pay me.
Yes, exactly. And so that's a big problematic issue. It's turned out too, that they stole these books from pirate sites, downloaded them from pirate sites. that surely is illegal. That's before the courts now too. So with all of those controversies around whether it's ethical or professional for an author to use these tools and how they can use these tools and to what extent they can use these tools, as well as for designers, as well as for music, as well as for Hollywood. And so that range of controversy remains unresolved. And anyone coming to AI at this point does, I think, have an obligation to at least understand the controversy, understand where the complaints are coming from, and make their own decision about the validity before they move forward. They may choose not to move forward with AI, which is fine and reasonable. But if they do move forward with it, I advocate, that you do so with full awareness of the risks.
And can you talk a little bit, Thad, about the author backlash specifically? You made a big point of that in the book, especially in the UK and I think the Authors Guild. And I think our audience would appreciate hearing a little bit more about that.
Yes, on the one hand, on the other hand, let's talk about the Authors Guild for a moment. The Authors Guild has taken a very clear stand around these controversies, not of advocating that the courts find against the AI companies for fair use and for purloining these books. On the other hand, the Authors Guild has reached an agreement with a company called Created by Humans, which is a licensing organization which provides individual authors with the opportunity to license their work to AI companies. And so we're at this interesting sort of push-pull time in the history of publishing where, on the one hand, there's controversy and so many authors and publishers would be delighted if tomorrow morning they woke up and found out that this stuff was all a sham and had been shut down and disappeared, just get rid of it. On the other hand, it's becoming increasingly obvious that it's not going anywhere. And the only way to move forward within any profession, in particular the creative professions, is to find a way to embrace it. And so we're straddling those two sides of the equation.
But isn't there some author resistance to specifically to having trade publishers use AI tools on their books?
Yes, that's such an interesting point too. I'm seeing with certain publishers that they'll say, for example, that we'll use AI for kind of everyday tasks like data analysis or preparing marketing materials, but we'll never use it on the creative side of publishing. And we're also seeing authors who are insisting that their agents get into their contracts, no AI will be used, in the production of my book. Mm-hmm. And again, while it's understandable, I don't think it's feasible. I don't see how it's going to be possible to run a publishing company 3 years from now without a very robust embrace of these tools. It's going to become necessary in the competitive market. But nonetheless, there will have to be some kind of ethical guardrails, but it can't be a substantial prohibition of the tools. That's not realistic.
I agree with you 100%. In the couple of hundred or so publishers that we deal with, there's just a great interest in how AI can make them more efficient, either through us using certain tools or them using certain tools that we provide. But the interest is there. You make a very interesting point in your book about how ChatGPT was able to garner 100 million monthly users in just 2 months, compared to Facebook taking over 2 years. Why did that happen? How did it happen so fast?
Larry, when you and I were talking about it the other day, I thought you made a great point that, it's not like Facebook's difficult to use. And, one of my arguments as to why this happened with ChatGPT is it's so easy to use. It's a straightforward interface. What can I do for you today kind of thing. And you can talk on your phone into it, ask you questions, or type on your keyboard. And so that is a simple interface, but it's not any simpler, arguably, than a social media interface. And yet, clearly there's something that people perceive as more profoundly powerful and transformative about AI. I think that people instinctively get a sense of the breadth of its powers, let's call it that. And that, then too points to where the anxiety comes from. This thing that is that powerful is going to make you anxious, but it has, drawn people in unprecedented numbers and continues, to grow by leaps and bounds.
Let's talk about some of the uses for AI. AI for voice narration for audiobooks and translations into other languages seems to be one of the big uses for publishing companies. Can you talk about how that can actually help level the playing field for the smaller and the hybrid publishers?
Sure. They, again, as you know, Larry, it's, been, tremendously and remains tremendously controversial to can you use these tools? Should you use these tools for those two tasks in particular, for audiobook creation and for translation? And yeah, I've been looking at it pretty closely for several years now, and the answer is yes, you can. I mean, technically, yes, you can. People will say regarding the audiobooks, oh, I listened to them, it sounded like a computer. And it's like, then you weren't using the latest technology, because the latest technology, it doesn't sound like a computer. It sounds like a human. And the one I heard the other day from this company called 11 Labs, who's a leader in this technology, they've found a way now to create the soundtrack at the same time that they're doing the audio narration. So what you get from their AI system, is the book complete with multiple voices and a soundtrack generated by the machine. And that's astounding, right? That's astounding compared to what we had a few years ago. Likewise, on the translation side, it's very, very good, very good. This one company that's a startup, is claiming that they don't even need a kind of post-edit stage. I would still recommend, to anyone using AI translation, that it be for a post-edit stage. But where the apprehension comes in, of course, is this going to take jobs away from, on the one hand, narrators of audiobook, producers, et cetera, of audiobooks, and over here, a large number of translators, vast number, really work, day to day in and around publishing and outside of publishing on translation from, the 200 most common languages that require translation. There's over 200 languages that have more than 5 million speakers. So the opportunities, huge. Where I've always advocated, is do not think of these technologies as replacements, but as augmentations. Do not use an AI system where the economics are such that you could use a human for the task and let them do their excellent work in the way they always have. But consider that particularly as you're saying, for smaller publishers where they didn't have the resources to make audiobooks for, much of their list, in those instances, and also looking at, a larger number of languages, because you can make audiobooks in multiple languages as well as doing the translations for the text version. And if that is a way to expand your market and to reach more readers, and also, with audiobooks, you're reaching all of the print impaired readers, people who can't read the text but can listen to it. So that, to me, is fantastic.
Sure. And we've worked with 11 Labs also, and I agree with you, some of the stuff that they put out. We've done some informal research, surveys, I should say, just in the office, nothing, large numbers or anything, but people can't tell the difference, cannot decide which is the AI voice and which is the professional narrator. And I find that fascinating. And you would, on that note, you would also mention, talking about translations, I mean, you would also mention that you think that the AI translations have made tremendous progress in showing emotions and in translating into a different language with very rich text as opposed to just like word for word years ago, which you said bodes very well for translations of fiction. And you were a little bit more skeptical, I think, about nonfiction because of the possibility for incorrect facts. Do I have that right, Thad?
Yeah, when it comes to translation, one issue that we've skirted around so far today is the hallucination problem, that everyone's heard so much about, of the machines making stuff up, stupid stuff, and making up citations or titles of books that don't exist. That's been a big problem in the past. Again, AI changes so quickly that what I'm seeing in the last month or so is new systems that really reduce the hallucination problem, to a bare minimum and very manageable level. Keep in mind, humans make mistakes too, right? We hold AI to a standard of perfection, but people are allowed to screw things up. So, we have checks and balances in place for our own errors, and to have checks and balances in place for AI errors seems to be just a normal part of it. But, so when you're talking about translation, the possibility of this kind of hallucination is there. But I think what you're alluding to more is, that your translation, do you translate word for word, as it used to be you could only do it that way. Now, where you could do it word for word or more for the sense of it, where, because the language models are fluent and fluid, they do a wonderful job creating the sense of it, even if, the word for word would not be accurate. But if you're relying on them for the precision, word for word translation, particularly, for example, with the medical text where getting the wrong word can have tremendous ramifications, there the AI is, less to be relied upon, let's say.
Sure. Let's talk about junk books. You mentioned that before. What do you see as the long-term effects of millions of AI-generated junk books on book discovery for readers and for non-established authors?
Yeah, there's two things there, Larry. On the one hand, on the other hand. So on the one hand, I point out, in the book and when I'm chatting with people about this, that, the last year, I think it was 2023, where we had record numbers for the number of ISBNs issued in that year for English language books. And the number was upwards of 2.5 million new titles that were published that year. So we can presume that it's continuing along a similar pace, perhaps larger, perhaps slightly smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And as Mike Shatkin has pointed out frequently, and I really like the point that he makes there, is that books don't go to print anymore once they're in a digital instance, and so there's at least how many 40 million, 50 million books that are available through Amazon or through Ingram, and so you're adding in a couple million to this $40-50 million base of books, and that's a discoverability problem, right? And so, the idea that AI books are going to make that worse, well, arguably, yes, but it's such a mess already, that I don't think that's first and foremost, the way we should be envisaging the problem of potential, junk books being done by Amazon. Furthermore, I point this out, I think in the book, it's stuck in my head at any rate, that, I think of Amazon as a virtuous system. No one usually associates virtue with Amazon, but, when you look at your own practices for book buying or, buying any other product on Amazon, we look at the reviews. We always look at the reviews, right? And we always say to authors, you've got to get 30 reviews or more because it's not credible when it's a small number of reviews. And the junk books don't get good reviews. Mostly they don't get reviews at all. If someone inadvertently purchases one and realizes what a piece of junk it is, then it gets a very bad review. So these things don't rise to the surface. They, sink to the ocean floor. So in that sense, I'm also not terribly concerned about junk books. Yeah, potential issue. Yeah, there's, something there, but it's not our big problem.
That's a great point, Thad. Thank you. Some of the biggest legal battles appear to be around copyright issues, especially in the training of LLMs and even smaller AI platforms dedicated to a specific publishing discipline. The current administration does not exactly appear to look favorably upon those copyright protections. Where do you see this going, this mess?
It's a mess. That was the first word that was in my mind too. Mess. Yep, I've gained several things there, Larry. On the one hand, we're looking to the courts for clarity, and people often reference the Google Books case of 15 years ago as a comparator to the AI case, the copyright cases that are going on now. And one of the key things to remember about that earlier litigation is that it dragged on for the better part of 10 years. And so too does it appear probable that the AI copyright legislation or litigation will go through the multiple cycles of appeal and new decisions and new cases being added in and da, 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 da. So I think assuming that in the next 2 to 3 years we'll have clarity from the courts is not realistic. And we're getting all kinds of conflicting signals at this point. And as you point out, in the meantime, the Trump administration, has issued its new AI initiative, and Trump himself, in talking about the new AI regulations that they've posited, it says that copyright fair use should be in law. Now, can they change the law mid litigate? I have no idea, but clearly that's the signaling going forward, is that if you as an author publish your book, it can be, they can buy one copy, scan it, and subsume that into an AI training system. So we as a authoring community and publishing community have to get our minds around that changing landscape. And there's still lots and lots of things for us to sort of think through in terms of the ramifications, implications, revenue aspects. It's going to be chaotic for a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, thank goodness it's still up to the courts, hopefully. Well,
You have
yes,
more
as
faith
you're
in them
saying,
than I do.
we will see. Well, finally, Thad, what advice would you give to small to mid-sized publishers about their potential use for AI for their publishing endeavors?
I would say you gotta jump in both feet. It's like, well, Thad, you're saying all these horrible things about it and the risks and so on, and yeah, I am, saying about the risk, but I don't see how. It's like, if you don't use it, will it go away? No, right? It's here. One thing, people think perhaps, if Washington, which is showing no inclination to regulate things, if they change their minds and decided to regulate OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, and so on, it wouldn't work, right? That too much of the technology has been permeated via open source. You can't put this genie back in the bottle.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's certain that innovative authors and publishers are going to be using these tools. Will the use of these tools by the competition make you, less able to access the marketplace compared to your competition? Publishing is not like, 2 cans of soup, but nonetheless, the competitive pressure, I think, will grow. And so my advocacy to publishers is, find a way in which you're comfortable morally, ethically, to use the technology and move forward with it. At a minimum, understand how it works. And if you decide still to reject it, do so from a position of knowledge. But, there's so many kind of amazing things this can do that, I don't see any way, not to move forward.
Well, thank you, Thad. This has been a fascinating conversation. As always, talking to you. We appreciate it. And if any publishers would like to get in touch with you, we'll be putting your contact information on the screen.
That'd be great, Larry. Thanks for inviting me.